rime de l'évangile. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Du législateur tout s'accomplira. Celui qui s'élève, on l'abaissera. Celui qui s'abaisse, on l'élèvera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Le vrai catéchisme nous instruira. Et l'affreux fanatisme s'éteindra. Pour être à la loi docile. Et chaque Français s'exercera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Malgré les mutins, tout réussira. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Aaliyah Ranjit Singh, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. And I'm very honored and excited to welcome you to today's event, Revolutions and Generations, a conversation with Nathan Perl-Rosenthal and David G. Troyansky. This is the first in an 8-part series to celebrate recent books by Brooklyn College faculty that we're hosting. And today, of course, we celebrate history professor David G. Troyansky and the book Entitlement and Complaint, Ending Careers and Reviewing Lives in Post-Revolutionary France. Professor Troyansky is joined by University of Southern California professor Nathan Perl-Rosenthal, author of The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It. And we're honored to host them and excited for the conversation ahead. I invite you to please join us for other upcoming book events. And you can find the schedule for the series on the link shared in the chat. So there we have the link in the chat. And I also want to invite you to please follow the Wolf Institute on social media to learn about these events and the rest of our upcoming programming. And of course, you may find a link in the chat as well to our social media pages. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be hosted on the Wolf Institute's YouTube channel. We ask that you please keep your microphones muted throughout the talk, and we'll leave time at the end of today's event for members of the audience to ask questions and to offer comments. So let's introduce today's speakers. So Nathan Perl-Rosenthal is professor of history, French, and Italian, and law at the University of Southern California. His most recent book is The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It, a generational history of the Atlantic Revolutionary Era, the 1760s to the 1820s. He's now working on 2 books, A History of the Long American Revolution, told through a study of the thousands of surviving 4th of July orations, to appear in 2026, and A Global History of Maritime Prize Law in the Making and Unmaking of European Empires, circa 1600 to 1850, both under contract with Basic Books. Our next speaker, of course, David G. Troyansky, is professor of history and the former chair of the history department at Brooklyn College. And he's also at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is the author of Old Age in the Old Regime, Image and Experience in 18th Century France, published in 1989 by Cornell University Press, and Aging in World History, published in 2016 by Routledge, and Entitlement and Complaint, Ending Careers and Reviewing Lives in Post-Revolutionary France, Oxford University Press, 2023. And he is the co-editor of 3 books in French and Francophone studies. And he's co-editing a 6-volume cultural history of old age for Bloomsbury Press. So thank you, Nathan, and thank you so much, David, for your books and for sharing them with us today. I look forward to the conversation. So I now turn the microphone over to you, David.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks so much for the introduction, Aaliyah. Thanks to Gaston Alonso, who's the director of the Institute. He couldn't be here today, but he's the one who was really encouraging this event. And Kiana Benjamin, who's been doing so much to make this work. So we're meeting at this hour, so my class on modern France can attend, and so it doesn't get too late for Nathan, who's in Paris. Nathan and I are going to be talking about these latest books and using them as jumping off points for discussing some major historiographical questions or controversies. And it occurred to us that although the books are doing very different things, particularly with different geographic scopes and different historians' problems, they're both addressing questions of revolution, post-revolution, and generation, with generation perhaps the key to the discussion. Although, we use the term a little bit differently, but we can get into that. Now, at first, we thought we would introduce our own books, but then we agreed each of us would briefly summarize the other's book in order to begin the discussion, with some back and forth about our readings of each other, and then a turn towards several major issues. Now, the flyer that advertised this refers to different cohorts' experiences of revolution, whether they'd grown up in a pre-revolutionary era, matured in time of revolution, or operated in a longer-term aftermath of revolution. And it refers to what it meant to be a revolutionary and to build identities in the shadow of revolution, as well as how revolutionary pasts fed into the creation of institutions associated with the modern political world. I think we'll be getting to each of those things along the way, but eventually we're going to organize our discussion according to 4 big topics. One of them is methodology, how we've both crossed disciplines in these books. A second is the theme of life course. How does that perspective contribute to what we've done? A third is periodization. How are we working across divides of old regime and revolution and extending the chronological scope beyond what is traditionally done? And finally, comparison. To what extent are we thinking comparatively as we go from place to place? So we'll get to those shortly. First, Nathan's book. I see it both as a really compelling read, combining many familiar and unfamiliar individuals, and as a very ambitious effort to pull together an extraordinary number of historical events and issues, to globalize the history of the revolutionary era, or at least to contribute to a collective effort to Atlanticize it, and to balance 2 different modes of doing history, narrative and analysis. The global or Atlantic approach isn't new in itself, and these days it seems to be cropping up everywhere. He refers back to the old classic work by R. Palmer, The Age of Democratic Revolution, and also to some more recent efforts. I'm thinking, for example, of Janet Pulaski's Revolutions Without Borders, a book that I've taught a couple of times. But I also think of Alan Taylor reaching south from his usual territory in North America to cover the entire hemisphere. Now, we should perhaps heed David Bell's cautionary advice about going too global when some historical questions really do need to be answered or addressed locally, but the trend is almost irresistible. And here's where the methodological question deserves attention. So Nathan has pulled together multiple stories. He's got 7 principal individuals and many more characters in such disparate places as British North America and the US, France, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Haiti, Peru, and elsewhere. We have individuals like the American John Adams, who's treated in terms of career making. That was something I paid a lot of attention to. The naturalist Louis-Augustin Bosc, as in Bosc pears, working in the evolving political and scientific world of Paris. Madre Maria and Madre Transito, nuns in conflict at the convent of Santa Catalina in Cusco in Peru. Marie Brunel, a free woman of color in Saint-Domingue, the future Haiti, and a refugee in Pennsylvania, married to a white man, Joseph Brunel. Hasidic rabbis of Eastern Europe, and it goes on. The book moves chronologically, but weaves together multiple narratives and introduces cultural materials, images, music, literature at crucial moments. Sometimes there are explicit connections between individuals, but it's, I think, the analytical move of thinking generationally that really ties things together. And in the end, I suspect he believes that the success of a book depends upon that kind of analysis. In each of his places, there's a first generation that grows up in a pre-revolutionary environment. They find themselves drawn to revolution for reasons that might be political, economic, cultural, or simply biographical. But they carry with them the assumptions of an earlier era. and they often display an inability to cross divides that characterized their old regime societies. In other words, there quickly emerges a revolutionary political elite and a more popular class of historical actors. A second generation comes to maturity in a time of revolution and benefits from an experience of social mixing. Indeed, sociability is one of his key themes. In some cases, the multi-generational story means the institutionalization of a revolutionary movement. But in other cases, it involves political reaction. And I think that's a problem we ought to pursue in greater detail. How does a modern political culture become institutionalized? Does it involve a turn in a conservative direction? I think much depends upon whether we're looking from a mid-19th century perspective or a much more modern perspective. When he uses the term illiberal, he seems to have an eye on the present, but I think we need to ask him that. Let me make one more comment on the book. What's exciting and challenging about it is it's probing multiple places that have their own complicated histories. Of course, we find ourselves in constitutional conventions, national assemblies, Jacobin and other political clubs, imperial courts, etc. But we also find ourselves in Peruvian convents and Eastern European shtetls. At first blush, it's not so obvious how they connect, but Nathan employs ideas of reform and resistance, of challenge to authority, the making of demands, and a search for stability to make things hang together, that is, hang together in his book. And I admit that aside from the big claims he's making, he's also succeeded in telling some unforgettable stories. And at this point, I think it makes sense for me to ask, what did I get wrong?
Well, I mean, I have to start by thanking you, David, not only for that extraordinarily generous and, aside from highly accurate, I mean, that's not that surprising, but generous, also not that surprising, but perhaps less to be passed over summary of the book. And I just want to also say thank you to Leah for the introduction, and also to David for inviting me to be part of this, and to thank everyone who's here, including some friends and colleagues. It's really, really nice to be part of this, especially on a Zoom hosted by CUNY, where I feel I got the best part of my education, with apologies to my teacher who's on this call. So I think you've put your finger on exactly on a couple of the crucial points here. I actually completely agree with you, and with David Bell, that there is a real danger in the kind of global, or even in the Atlantic turn, but especially in the global turn, of kind of networking to excess, or expanding to the point where you end up at it. I mean, there are different ways of thinking about it. Maybe it's that you connect everything so much that it becomes homogenous, or maybe it's that you go up to such a high level of generality in order to talk about things together that you lose the kind of specificity of the local. I feel very strongly that, and I wrote an article about this and posted in 2017, that there's a real difference between kind of connective histories of the Age of Revolutions and what I call in that article contextual histories. I actually see Janet is on this call, and I think Janet's written probably the best connective history of the revolutionary era. I mean, she's got this Revolutions Without Borders is this wonderful history of people moving among revolutionary movements. And it is kind of incredible when you look at this cast of characters to see how dynamic they are and how effective they are at kind of connecting movements that you wouldn't necessarily think are tightly connected to one another. So I think that is really crucial. And, you actually see Palmer, just to go back to Palmer again, R.R. Palmer's Age of the Democratic Revolution. He does a fair amount of that. And that book is sometimes, I think, mistaken for a connective history. But what I think Palmer does, what I certainly am interested in trying to do, is taking seriously the quiddity, the specificity of each revolution. And so I could not, honestly, I could not have said it better myself. In fact, I have never said it better myself than you. The idea that there's sort of an analytic move that tries to hold together all of these, what I think are actually fairly different, dispersed revolutionary movements by thinking about how they all change generationally. And I mean, I think in some sense, if you think about specifics of the Age of Revolutions, the idea that it's all one thing falls apart very quickly. I mean, when George Washington says liberty in 1776, he means something completely different than what, in fact, he means the opposite of what Toussaint Louverture means when he says liberty in 1794 or 1798, right? One of them means the liberty to keep their property in slaves, and the other one means the liberty to not be enslaved. So, you know, ideologically speaking, those are not be the pointing in completely opposite directions. But again, I think in the process, as you said, in the process of revolutionary organizing, in the process of revolutions coming into shape, I think you do sort of analytically, I hope, able to bring together some of these disparities and to see homologies and similarities, while also respecting the fact that, as I think you said beautifully, that that they are really quite distinct. I do want to talk more about the illiberalism, the word illiberalism, and I'm going to confess that, or I'm going to blame it on someone else. My teacher, my maître, Isser Wallach, who wrote this wonderful essay in 1990. I think it's in the American Historical Review on the latent illiberalism of the French Revolution, which is a kind of review of and critique of François Furet and Mona Ouzouf's critical dictionary of the French Revolution. And I've sort of never gotten over that article, which is just beautifully written and so incisive. But I have always felt that language that Isser uses there really works. That it both reflects something real about that it's not totally alien to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but that it also really does, and I think here you're right, it does bring it into conversation with the present, as it always is, right? The French Revolution and the Revolutionary era, I think, are always in conversation with the present. So I tried not to run away from that. Yeah, I mean, I just thank you for that. And we should talk maybe about entitlement and complaint now. What do you think?
Sounds like it.
All right. So we're talking about illiberalism in the French Revolution. So I feel like this is the right moment. Entitlement and Complaint, the other book on the table here, is a history of an early example of a modern retirement scheme, or of an early modern retirement scheme or plan, and the people who used it, maybe created it, who were imbricated with it. This is a book that's set mostly in sort of deceptively modestly in the first half of the 19th century, mostly in France. It's a little bit in the late 18th, but it's mostly the first half of the 19th century, mostly in France. But it does also go into the larger French Empire, even though you sort of discover that as you go along, and suddenly we're hearing about Mauritius. You're Ile-de-France. It's so it's set in the larger French Empire, not only in Europe but also beyond. And it's a book that comes out of this extraordinary set of sources. And for those of us who are French historians, I think we've had the experience of being in the Archives Nationales and sort of stumbling on some trove, and that's clearly what happened here. There's an extraordinary trove that David has used. So these are dossiers produced by magistrates, by judges, who were asking the Justice Ministry for pensions in the early 19th century. Or as the case may be, and this is part of what the book hinges on, maybe they're not asking for them, maybe they're demanding them as an entitlement. And these dossiers are very rich. They include a variety of materials. They all include some kind of request. Some of them include, or all of them, I think, seem to include narrative, a sort of narrative of one's life, of one's service. A lot of them include some kind of supporting documentation as well. And if I'm not mistaken, some of these dossiers also contain the work documents that are then produced by the ministry itself. So what you have here is a kind of conversation almost between this core of magistrates aging magistrates who are demanding, asking, looking for something from the state, and producing all of this material, all of this description of themselves and their world, and asking the state to give them something in return. And David basically takes these dossiers from several different angles. And I think that's one of the most distinctive things about the book is that, I think a lot of people faced with this kind of corpus would say, well, I'm going to take a blank approach. And David is sort of like, why take a blank approach when you could take 3 approaches? So there's a kind of social history dimension. In fact, there's even what I called cliometrics in an email to him. I hope that's not a bad word. But he actually counted things, and there are tables, quite a few tables actually. I got very happy when I saw the tables. I thought, wow, this is still happening. Great, I could do this too. Partly through a sampling of different regions. So there's a kind of, for those of you who remember the French history of the 70s, the sort of sampling of different regions of different parts of the country, the Southeast, the Northwest, the East, the center. So that's one dimension of it, is a kind of using these as social history documents, a serial source almost. There's another dimension which looks at them from a more cultural historical perspective. And here, David is interested in them as rhetorical or discursive documents. And I would say there's both an analysis of the rhetoric of, in the simple sense of the word, of the rhetoric of demands, but there's also an analysis of the entire dossier, in a sense, of the whole process as a kind of rhetoric of demanding, right? So that it's not just what you say, it's also he's thinking about how you mobilize all of these different pieces of the story. And then finally, he thinks about these, not even finally, he thinks about these as biographical documents, thinks about them as sources for narrative of of these individuals' lives. And in the process of looking from at least these 3 angles, and maybe there are more that I'm hiding beneath these, David draws in social science literatures from a number of areas, but in particular on aging and the life cycle, in order to kind of enrich the analysis of these dossiers. So there's this extraordinary corpus looked at from multiple angles at the same time. And what really emerges from this study is a picture of an aging, of course, cohort of mostly revolutionaries, or people at least who are contemporaries of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, and an emergent modern institution. Sorry, I'm going to use air quotes here because that's a bit of a question. This kind of pension system, and what I think of as the kind of rough meeting between them, right? This kind of rough meeting between an institution in formation and a group of people who are trying to create it, trying to call it into existence, trying to demand things from it. And the overall arc, in a sense, is very clear. The overall arc is a shift from pensions, and I think this is even in the subtitle of the 2nd chapter, a shift from pensions as favor to pensions as right. And in fact, you see chapter 3 is really an accounting of the legal changes that lead you from a notion of favor to a notion of right. But what's amazing in the course of this book is that, and I think this is really what gives it its kind of zing, is that it's at any given moment, because of this multi-angled approach, it's so clear that at any given moment, it's very hard for the people who are in this system, who are engaging with it, right, the magistrates, to know where they are in this process of transition, because they don't know, they are not clear on what's happening. From the outside, in a sense, it's clear that there's this transition happening. But for the magistrates on the inside, they don't really know where they are between this world of favor and this world of right. And so what you see is this kind of rhetorical fancy footwork, rhetorical dance, as the magistrates try, with all of the different strategies at their disposal, to figure out how, in the particular configuration that they seem to be in at this moment, they're going to get what they want. And so you see them deploying all sorts of different strategies. They'll throw infirmity. I'm infirm, so I need a pension. So I have a right to a pension. I'm infirm, so I need a pension, which you should give me because it's the right thing to do, right? You see them throwing out the notion of right, of droit. And of course, David starts the book with this anecdote about the power of the word droit in France, which is absolutely true. If you say you have a droit to something here in France, I'm in France right now, that's the most powerful assertion you can make, even if it's the droit to separate bananas from the bunch in the grocery store. that that will entitle you to do it, whereas otherwise no. There's the notion, right, of their political their political correctness, their political virtue that they try to mobilize. And what's fascinating is to see them, these very, clever, very skillful political actors, because they are, of course, trying to figure out how to maneuver themselves through this system that's still in formation. And so I think what one comes to from reading this book is a sense that a couple of things. I mean, I think there were 2 or 3 things that I felt like I really wanted to highlight. For one, to my mind, there was in a way a story here about the ways that old age is not senescence, that in fact this old age for them is in fact a kind of generative moment in a way. I mean, it may be generative bureaucratically, but they're actually generating and changing this system as they're engaging with it. And so they're actors in the process of bureaucratization in a very dynamic way. And in the sense that insofar as bureaucratization, the story of bureaucracy coming into its own is a kind of central story that we tell about the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic era. These oldsters, I mean, a lot of them are really old, some of them are in their 80s, are central actors in that, or I think are come into themselves as being central actors. I also think in a way that this is a book with a much broader set of claims. And in particular, I think it's making a claim very quietly, but I think consistently, about the transition, a kind of Weberian, that's Max Weberian transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, right? From a kind of face-to-face community from an old regime world to the modern bureaucratic world. And I think that the argument here is that it's so messy and it's so hard for the people who are from the outside. It might look very clear. It might look like, oh, well, this transition is happening, right? Which is sort of the, Tocqueville's view in the old regime of the French Revolution. Well, we can see it happening. There it happened. But for the people he's showing us who are in the middle of this machine, in the middle of this process, it's baffling. And they're kind of swimming around and throwing every spaghetti at the wall to try to make that work. And I think that's a really important insight to really take the actor's perspective, a kind of anthropological view of the creation of bureaucracy. I think that's part of what this book gives us. All right, said my piece.
Yeah, that was as you said about what I did is accurate. It was also really, really generous. And there are a couple of things you had to say about living in uncertainty. I think that I wasn't so explicit about. I think it's been a little while since I looked back at what I wrote, but I think that's right. I think there is a way in which I've always been drawn towards combining different approaches, both social and cultural. And here it needed to be social, cultural, and political. I think just to build on what you said about these people who are trying to make their way through the system, you get a sense of the messiness when they start talking about how they want a right to a favor. It's not like, favor is one thing, right is another. It's they're mixed up. And there are ways in which the bureaucracy, and you singled out chapter 3, which I think is the dullest chapter in the book because it's all this bureaucratic stuff, the development of, I gave my students chapter 2, which is getting across the sort of revolutionary Napoleonic era. But you've got these better known magistrates who are in positions of authority during the Restoration who are talking about what the system ought to look like. And then we've got people on the ground saying what they think it ought to look like. And then responding to whatever they see coming from the ministry. I think it could be that some of these magistrates learned how to make excuses for themselves and make arguments by listening to other people in their own courts. And it's something that they sort of had at their fingertips. And there was a way in which I think they had a control of a certain kind of complaint that widows who were also writing in didn't quite have. the rhetoric is a bit different. There's a late chapter on widows' demands. Yeah, maybe we should go through those big themes that we talked about along the way: methodology, life course, periodization, and comparison. And maybe I would also just thanks to all those colleagues and friends who are out there. And since you mentioned Isser's influence, I'll mention, one of the early books that took the chronology past the Napoleonic period was Isser's thing on the new regime, which sort of pointed in that direction. And he had worked earlier on some pensions as well. So we can pay homage to him right now. But let's go to these big
maybe
questions.
Maybe we should talk about the periodization. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. Maybe we should jump into that.
Okay, periodization. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when you're handling these different places where sometimes there's a clear impact of what's going on in one place on another, okay? Spanish monarchy collapses, changes what's going on in the Spanish Empire, right? Or, whatever it happens to be. But it's like you're dealing with these intergenerational relations and strategies by individual generations that are not all in parallel. I mean, it's something you were talking about already, that, okay, you're telling a kind of collective history, and in order to get it all in, it has to be this longer period, right? But it made it a challenge for you in putting it together to figure out, how do you go from 1770s to 1820s when you're moving from one place to another, and one is entering revolution in one decade and another is in a different one. So I kept, as I was reading, I would pause periodically and think, okay, how parallel are these histories? How connected are these histories? You really made me think about that. And then is there a kind of process of first generation, second generation that we can observe in these different places? So that was my take on your periodization. A quick word about what I was doing, because in some ways I'm looking at people who live in the shadow of the revolution. So it's sort of driven by what begins there, where people are talking about rights. But my whole approach also depends upon moving backwards from a more modern era, because when we talk about things like the history of retirement pensions, we are automatically drawn to the Bismarck pensions in the 1880s, or we're drawn to the welfare state in the 20th century. And I had a sense as I was starting the project that, okay, there are some issues raised by the revolution, but then there's this other set of issues long after. And surely there's something going on in between. And so I end up moving forward and backward. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the sort of the common thread, or one of the common threads, I think, in how, at least from my sense of, I'm going to sort of talk about your book as well as my book, and you can tell me when I'm wrong. But I mean, I think we one of the things that I noticed that we both do is rely more explicitly, I would say, than certainly most historians of the French Revolution have, I think, on some social scientific literature. So I mean, for me, Bourdieu was very important as a theoretical sort of framing. And I did, a fair amount of reading about generations as well, the sort of sociological, there's apparently a category of scholar called generational analysts now. There are people who study these kinds of questions. And, I think part of what I found useful about certainly the kind of social scientific, even scientific work on generations, which is very lightly cited in the book, but it's there, a couple things, was precisely to kind of de-hang-upify me about generations. I mean, I think the thing that historians tend to read is actually quite old, right? Is Mannheim, which is now about 100 years, more than 100 years old. And things have happened in the past 100 years intellectually. Data has been accumulated. And so some of the things that he's asserting in the context in which he's writing, I think are not really applicable anymore. And so, one of the arguments I think that increasingly scholars of generations have made is that, it's a pretty approximate, it is inevitably a fairly approximate measure. I mean, I noticed certainly, David, your people had a pretty wide range of birthdays. I mean, I was paying attention to their birthdays because I was thinking, okay, so how do they fit into my schema? And some of them really did grow up in the old regime, and some of them are basically babies of the revolution, right? I mean, and that's those are very different experiences to be 15 in 1770 in France versus to be set 15 and in 1790. I mean, those are very different life courses that you're about to have in all likelihood. But for me also, Bourdieu is very important in trying to think about, okay, so how is it possible to think across all of these places? And I guess without what I'm hoping is that the reliance both of us had on these kinds of scholarship suggests that maybe we can go back to using some of that kind of work. I mean, I think there was a big reaction against that after the 80s, against relying on social scientific scholarship, and but there's a lot that's useful there, and it doesn't mean that you then have to do cliometrics or town reconstructions or something like that. That there are ways of mobilizing it in a more cultural vein, I guess. I don't know if that resonates with you as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've never been a cliometrician, but I've been, adjacent maybe to some of that, just as I've been adjacent to the historical demographers. And I think there are questions that we ask that can be answered in a more social scientific way. Maybe we're less naive about what came from family reconstitution and a certain style of family history. It's worth something, even if it didn't answer all the questions they thought they were going to answer. On question of generation, I think we just have one of the people on this this call is Stephanie, graduate student at Princeton, who's writing a dissertation about Zigaridi, who's writing a dissertation on generations in France, but over even a longer period of time than we've been doing. So I think that's empirical evidence that there's a revival of interest in the very idea. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about I mean, I love the sort of analyses of the life course that you talk about this idea of the kind of the life review
Right.
as
Right.
I mean, I think it's a wonderful element of the book.
Well,
Maybe
talk about 100-year-old ideas. This is something that's half a century old, actually a little bit longer. And it goes back to one of the sort of founding moments in social gerontology. And it was Robert Butler, who was a key figure in that, who wrote an essay about the life review, as if this was a kind of normative thing that at the end of life, rather than thinking, everything just goes blank in the last months or years or whatever. No, when it goes through a process of reviewing what had happened. And this is an old idea, but it led to a discussion of whether there was a kind of successful or unsuccessful aging. And I think to some extent, the gerontologists to this day are talking about getting beyond the successful or unsuccessful aging process. But what I found useful was the idea that I could have these individuals reviewing their lives at different moments. So let's say you apply for a pension in the Restoration and you get turned down for one reason or another. Comes the revolution of 1830, there's a new regime, and you can tell the life history differently. Now, it could be we're dealing with the sort of perspective from middle age and then a perspective from more advanced age. Depends upon the accident of when they were born. But I was interested in the way there were certain continuities running through them, but also the way they were spinning the stories differently. And I think there was a way in which they were trying, especially in late life, they were trying to derive some kind of wisdom from their experience, even as they were making a demand for something really concrete.
Right.
So there are cases where it's easy to tell that they've changed the story in an unbelievable way. I mean, a regicide who claims to be a friend of the Bourbon family.
That's great.
There are other things like that. And of course, the documentation is all there, right? You can't escape this sort of stuff. But one other thing I think that maybe points in the direction of a sort of modern gerontology is the medicalization of all of this. On the one hand, there's this desire to reward a career. You get something for the work you did. And as of 1814, 1815, it's 30 years of service and 60 years of age. But, and you mentioned the infirmities. If you could demonstrate that your infirmity was caused by the work, then you could get something at 10 years. And that might mean I have an infirmity because I've been sitting so long. I've got urinary tract problems. I've got this, I've got that. I fell off a horse investigating a crime scene, whatever it happens to be. And there's a way in which they combine those things that might yield a good outcome with a sense of the overarching life. And often trying to juxtapose that life against the background of a kind of evolving narrative of French history.
Right, right. So, I mean, I just want to pick up on two things quickly, if I may. I mean, I think the first thing that I was thinking about this as I was reading. So Bosc, whom you mentioned, Louis Augustin Bosc, who the namesake of the Basque pear, he got universal name recognition, but nobody knows who he is. But only in the U.S. because they don't have Basque pears in France. Very ironically. So one of the main sources I used, actually, if you look at the notes, is his life review. Basically, it's notes for those who will write my biography, which is clearly written late in his life, and is, as your fellows' life reviews were, somewhat fictionalized, I think, certainly cleaned up in places, but extremely useful. But I guess I want to make a more, or sort of pick up on a more abstract point or more general point, which is I think you had a move there that you made when you mentioned the question of sort of how gerontologists have used this or have theorized this, right? That they have a kind of normative claim about it. And I think if I understood you correctly, and what I take you to be doing in a sense in this book is taking what for the social scientists is a normative claim and kind of saying, well, not taking it at its word, more or less, right? Saying, well, here's an interesting idea. Let's see if it works in this other context. And I that really I felt that was something also that I found to be important, right? That if there was sort of a social scientific hypothesis, which for them may be some normative claim, like in Bourdieu, one of the things that I was interested in doing, I wasn't explicitly testing exactly, but I would always treat it as a kind of experiment. And I think one could bring comparison under the same umbrella, because I also feel that comparison, there are normative claims, especially made by our friends in international relations and in disciplines like economics and sociology, and normative claims made about the importance of comparison, what you can learn from comparison, the necessity in certain cases of comparison. And I've sort of always felt that comparison it's a tool. It's something that, if you're faced with a multi-sided phenomenon, it's a good way of studying that multi-sided phenomenon in a multi-sided way, and not doing what, Mark Bloch denounces as, finding false causes of things by looking locally at things that are broader. But I think, for me at least, and I don't know if this is true for you as well, but sort of comparative work, or looking comparatively, because we David and I talked about before we had this conversation that, he's looking comparatively in a sense across time at modern welfare states and other welfare states. They're in the back. I mean, you mentioned, right, the German welfare state. These are comparisons which are on the page, but also very much, I think, in the but I suppose for me that the comparison always is always provisional, I guess, or the practice of comparison is always provisional, because it's only as useful as it's proving itself to be at any moment, that it doesn't get to dictate, in a sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and it brings to mind certain passages in your book where you're explicit briefly about a kind of comparison. How come this one went this way, that one went that way? But as long as it elucidates what you're trying to do, then it's worth doing. It's certainly. You're not gonna make the comparison somehow the heart of the book, but knowing a different case or a set of cases helps you figure out what's going on in an individual case. And I think that's something you've done. I think there were ways in which I played with comparisons between different regions of France. When I was going through these, you described the sort of aha moment of seeing these documents in a carton you happen to open in the archives. And so I thought, okay, I go through the first 10 cartons and they're from all over the country. And then I decided, well, wait a minute. So I sampled 6 different departments of France. And then I played with the idea that, okay, the religious, cultural, linguistic complications of Alsace may explain something here or there. If we're dealing with the region around Lyon or Marseille, there's going to be some peculiarity that's rooted in the history of the place. But I didn't take it very far. I think if I had tried to, it just would have collapsed. But I just saw it as a way of expanding the sample, and at some point saying, okay, enough is enough. I mean, I think in your case, there are these sort of little epiphanies here and there when you've got these comparative remarks.
Right. But I entirely agree with that, though. I actually think, I think in the scale is a little different of the sort of comparative frame. But I also felt that I think, look, I had many conversations with other scholars while I was writing the book, and several times people would say things to me like, well, X case is completely different from Y case. And my feeling was usually those two things are practically the same. And the answer, I think the correct answer was usually somewhere between the two. But I remember having a discussion with someone, an eminent scholar in one of the fields that I work in, who said, Boston is nothing like Cusco, nothing. There's nothing in common. And I was like, I don't know. It looks like two colonial elites with a large, subaltern population who are engaged in both of whom are engaged in a conflict with an empire, mostly about taxation. Looks pretty similar to me. But
I had that reaction. I had that reaction too, and I thought, oh yeah, this North and South American thing works. Maybe he's a little less secure in some of the transatlantic stuff, but this one worked for me.
Well, right. So, but the thing is, part of it, I think, is I think making the case. That was always a challenge for me. But also, I also think, look, the disease that historians have, sorry to the whole crew of historians here, the disease we have is we always want there to be more specificity. And it's a good disease, mostly, right? I think it's virtuous and it makes us stronger. But you do especially get into situations where it's just like you cannot get people out of the insistence on the ultimate specificity of whatever it is that their tiny context is. And you're like, no, like move up a level. Let's do a little bit of, what the, Jacques Revel called the jeu d'échelle, right?
Yeah,
You
right.
cannot remain only at the level of the particularity of the thing that you are interested in, right? There is always something in common. Sorry, I'm getting a little ranty now because this is one of the things that I spent years and years fighting with people about this. And I still fight with people about it. I mean, I was having a conversation with someone here who said, "Oh, this was about the new book that I'm doing on Admiralty law and or prize law." And he said, "Well, but the Admiralty of Sète has completely different procedures from the Admiralty de Marseille." And I was like, "These two things are almost exactly the same. You have just spent way too much time reading the documents from these two Admiralties, and so for you, they're like worlds apart. But if you look at any wider context." They're virtually indistinguishable. I mean, they even number them in the same order. Anyway, whatever. So yes, but I think there is a way in which, right, you've got to know when to kind of, when to move up a level and say, look, there are real homologies here. Are we're supposed to have questions, aren't we?
Yeah, I think we were told we should around 3:10 or something. And
Oh,
we're
good. Okay.
Should we do that now? If there are any, otherwise we can probably both continue to to talk. Stephanie, can we unmute her?
Hello. Everybody can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Hello. All of this has, of course, been really riveting, and I'm glad I got a chance to come in and hear it. So I was pretty taken by, or kind of interested in, what you mentioned, Nathan, about the way in which kind of social science scholarship has been able to, or has come back into vogue, maybe for some historians working on, France, and how this question, this battle of like specificity that you often have with historians. Perhaps maybe I think one of the reasons why historians tend not to be very taken with the topic of generations, or the question of generations, because as you say, it's something that in some ways lacks specificity, and that is its central quality, right? But regardless of its specificity, in both your book and in David's book, that category of a generation does something very different for your actors, or kind of is invoked or has the hopes of different outcomes, right? David is talking a lot about how a generation may offer rights or a particular set of endowments to people. And you're more interested, I would say, but I might be wrong, in how a generation might offer, or participating in, or being part of a generation might offer a sort of connected life experience all the way across the globe, from Cusco to Paris to Boston. And so I wonder if you guys think that the idea of generation that you use in both of your books is at all similar or has the same goals? Because to me, whether or not membership in a generation is about rights or about a feeling of belonging is kind of different. And I wondered if you guys could expand upon that.
Yeah. I mean, I think if I could refer to Nathan's book first and then to mine, I think Nathan is showing how there's some kind of political crisis that yields generation one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, to some extent, it already exists because there are people born decades before who have maybe some common experience, but this sets it off. And then something else. You can just count who's in the next generation. You can play with the numbers. But you could count 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is. With mine, it works in a couple of ways. One is there are these edicts that determine how the system works.
Mhm.
So that's one thing. Another is people who are telling their life histories and talking about what past generations had done and how they still are supporting the next generation.
Mhm.
Very different kind of thing, which I don't know. I haven't quite theorized in any sophisticated way, but it comes across in the language they use. Some of them, in making a claim for a pension, talk about 9 generations of service.
Mhm.
The actual, they're explicit about that. And then I have a couple who say, I couldn't help the fact that I came of age in this tumultuous time. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, I am of this generation. And it sets me apart from people before and people after. Maybe Nathan has something to.
Well, so I mean, I think there are a lot of ways to answer that very generative question. I guess I just want to sort of specify what I mean by it,
Mm.
which is actually quite Mannheimian, even though I was poo-pooing him a minute ago. Right, the idea is that there's a first generation which comes of age in the old regime, which I see as being the middle of the 18th century as being intensely hierarchical and profoundly kind of impregnated by ideas of hierarchy, and that then the revolutionary era of the last quarter of the 18th century functions as, and now I'm quoting Mannheim, a trigger action of a social and cultural process which produces generational differentiation. So that there
Mhm.
is the people who come of age in that last quarter of the 18th century have a collectively and distinctly different worldview habitus than the ones of the previous generation. So that's the claim about what generational change is. I don't think it's about conflict of generations, which is part of what Mannheim's article is about.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there's an AHR forum about generations, which is entirely about generational conflict for some
Yeah.
baffling reason, which I'm sure has a lot to do with the sociology of the people who were asked to participate in it, who were mostly from the 70s and 80s, born in the 70s and
Right.
80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So I think that that's what, at least what I'm trying to do. And I guess the question I would ask, or the question that comes to mind in response to your question, is what kind of category is generation?
Yeah.
What form of category is it? I think it's closest to, it's a form of social category,
Mm.
like class or race, probably. And I guess I would submit that those, not like those in the sense that it operates in the same way, but in the sense that it's a way of delineating a group of a population. And sorry, I mean race in the sense that historians use it to define a racialized group, not in the sense that there is such a thing as race, just to be clear. Um, uh, I think people who use those categories mean very different things by them. So I think it's a broader question about how you actually use social classification categories in the humanities, in history, certainly. I mean, we're generally pretty approximate about them, I would say, across the board. I mean, what people mean by class is very shifty from person to
Mhm.
person. Um, the social scientists are a lot more precise about these things, for good and for ill. But that's not exactly an answer, and it's more of a generalization of a way of generalizing the problem so that it's everybody's problem. I mean, I'm not sure that generation is a category that's so different from any of these other social categories that we use to kind of chop up the mass of people, right? Because they're all
Right.
imprecise. They're all, I mean, what is class? Is there an income level at which class, where you move from one class to the other? I mean, again, right?
Right.
Lots of ink has been spilled on that question. These are all approximations in one way or another that try to allow us to work with a population who are ultimately both individuals, members of families,
Mhm.
share demographic characteristics. So I think it's a different way of slicing,
Yeah.
which I agree with you, historians have been somewhat chary of. My hope is that maybe all the three of us can make historians less chary of it, because it seems crazy to me. But actually, I think it's more than that. I mean, Julie Hardwick, I don't think is on this call, but like Julie's work, Sex in the Old Regime City, that's not about old people, it's about young people. But her whole argument is, and I cite it a couple of times because I found it so useful, there's this period from like 15 to 30 where people in old regime France, men and women, are in this sort of intermediate space in their life course where they're neither children nor are they full adults, right? And it's this bendy, flexible, kind of malleable moment. But I actually think that's true also in a play. Again, I'm sorry, I'm going to go comparative on you again, but there's something similar that's true in 18th century New England, because it takes so long to assemble a competence. Young men don't marry until they're almost in their late 20s usually, if I'm remembering correctly from like reading Lockhart a billion years ago. Um, um, so I think there are stories that are important to tell about life course and about life stage, and slicing the social pie that way that are important. So I guess that's a defense of generations, but you're writing a dissertation about generations, so you need defenses of this.
Always.
Interesting way in which, Nathan, your use of generation runs up against those other categories. So that, let's say we've got people who are in the Jacobin Club, and then they're being challenged by some in popular societies who are more popular. They may be of the same generation, but obviously something else is intervening, and there are a number of other.
Definitely.
It's just one
Absolutely.
variable.
Well, yes, but in other words, I think the class can function also within generation, right? But really the argument, in a sense, if you wanted to really boil the argument of the book down, it's that the relations between classes and racial castes are different in the two generations that I'm looking at. I mean, that's the kind of, if you really want to have it down to a sentence, which, sort of makes you want to despair after you've written 500 pages, but.
Exactly. Are there other questions? Swapna, can she be unmuted?
Yeah, yeah.
There.
Okay. Thank you for this fascinating talk. And I have glimpsed through David's book, but I have not been able to check out your book, Nathan. But both books seem fascinating. And my question comes more out of ignorance than any informed knowledge about both of your fields. But the question is for both of you. And I'm wondering, you have brought in questions of generation, children figured in, but what was the gendered dimension of your research? Like I'm bursting with curiosities trying to find out if there were, women who were participants in their waging of it. In other words, were there women magistrates, who were waging for their rights? But likewise, in post-revolutionary world, I really like your broad comparative approach, Nathan. What was the gender component of your research?
Nathan, I think, will have more to say about this than I will. There weren't female magistrates, but there were widows who had a right to a pension and would write life histories. And so I devoted a chapter to them, but it also made me think about what was it about the rhetoric of the magistrates that could be, in a sense, appreciated through a gender lens. That is, they're writing as men. And so to that extent, it enters in. And there are also the questions of how they will place the next generation, their children, in a profession or marriage. But the language of the women differs. Some of my readers really liked that chapter on widows, and they weren't the heart of it, but I think I had enough material to do something serious with that. But Nathan has a lot more on this.
Well, I mean, I'll just state the obvious from the outset. There would be no generational history without women, obviously. And I was actually very annoyed that the cover of my book, so you can see the image behind me has lots of women in it. So I absolutely insisted that they use an image from this series of images, which are called the Le Sourd gouaches. They're in the Musée Carnavalet, the Museum of the City of the History of the City of Paris. And he did them on the spot and depicted enormous numbers of women and children, as you can see also over here, engaged in revolutionary politics. And I sent them like a dozen of them full of women and children, and they selected an image that was just a bunch of pikes. So anyway, there was nothing I could do about it, but the Spanish edition, which is coming out in like a month, they used an image with women on the cover. So anyway, to first say that, but for me, that was actually really, really important. I thought that it was crucial to think about the role that that women are playing in revolutionary politics, because there's been so much scholarship showing that in the past, let's say 30 years, 40 years at this point. And so what I did was, I mean, there are a number of ways in which women's activism becomes part of the story. But I would say that the most visible in the book, the one that's, the most sort of clearest, is that half of the biographical subjects who run through the book are women. So Maria de la Rivadeneira, this nun in Cusco, who's a nun, but she's also a member of a very wealthy Cusqueña, very politically connected Cusqueña family. And the argument I make about her is that she, well, and I'm not just the one making it, the Viceroy of Peru says in 1787 that she, Madre Maria, was personally responsible for all of the bad things that had happened in Peru in the past 10 years, which includes the largest colonial rebellion in Spanish American colonial history, the Tupac Amaru revolt. He essentially blames that on her. I mean, not exactly, but she's actually intimately involved in it. And the other one of the other women that I focus on is Marie Bunel, who's this extraordinary woman of color born in Saint-Domingue, who becomes a close ally of the leadership of the Haitian Revolution. She's a friend of Toussaint Louverture, but also of and especially of Henri Christophe. So for me, this was a way of thinking about the way that women are, let me say, political actors just like the men, but also the ways in which they have distinctive gendered ways of playing that role. I mean, Marie Bunel, so Madre Maria lives in a convent. She's a cloistered nun. So how does that work, right? How do you control political action from inside a convent? Actually, turns out that everybody's just coming into the convent all the time, but that's another story. But Marie Bunel also, she builds her power base actually by being a kind of a woman of fashion, and the kind of this a central, it's actually a very old regime way of building power, which she kind of transitions into the new regime, and becomes a kind of figure in the court, around the court of Henri Christophe when he creates a royal system. So for me, I thought that was essential to have that part of the story there. And I think women experienced the extraordinary upheaval of the revolutionary era at least as much as men, if not more. In chapter, I think it's chapter 10, where I talk about kind of the catastrophe of the wars of the end of the 18th century. Those hit women in many ways hardest, right? Because they're on the receiving end very often of the worst destruction, right? Not only destruction of homes and livelihoods, also of bodies, right? Violence, both ordinary but also sexual violence. So that the idea that a cohort of people come out of the other end of that unchanged seems to me, let's say, unlikely. There was one other thing I wanted to say, but now I can't remember what it was. But that was for me that, oh, well, this was one of the things. So this was one of the things that was most amazing to me about the comparative perspective, was it turns out, for instance, that, and I'm sorry if there are Latin Americanists on this call who are going to scoff at me for finding this out when I was, nearly 40, instead of knowing this, from childhood. In no part of the revolutionary world are women more directly involved in political activity than in Latin America. And nowhere are they targeted by counter-revolutionaries in larger numbers. A third of the people who were executed at the end of the Tupac Amaru revolt, 1780-81, are women. there is no other revolution that I know of where a third of the people executed are women. I mean, these are high-ranking women, leaders in various capacities. So that was one of the revelations to me, was if you look comparatively, you look at the story of women in the French Revolution, women in the American Revolution, but we're missing, the place that women actually are the most at the center, or that sort of North Atlantic history has really missed the place where women seem to be the most at the center, which is in Peru. And I would say who knew, but actually lots and lots of people knew. It's just they weren't, they're not read enough, or haven't been, by North Atlantic historians, and I count myself guilty as charged in that. But I'm recovering. I'm a recovering North Atlantic historian.
Are there other questions, or are we reaching the end? Jared.
Hello, is this on?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me? Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. So I was just wondering about how previously it was discussed about how as the generations go on, they have sort of different aspirations, different worldviews on how in the system from all different sides, and was wondering about those perspectives and how if we then can consider our own like present history to be consistent of different perspectives as the generations go on, and then how our modern perspective then shapes how we witness history. I'm just wondering, like, how does it help it? How does it hurt it? Is there a bias? I'm just wondering of those circumstances.
Jared, thank you for being the one student who's asked a question, one undergraduate who's asked a question. That's great. Nathan, do you want to take that, or should I? Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely works. And I think Nathan mentioned earlier on this sort of field of studies, of generational study. And I think some of it may be scholarly and some of it is very popular, because there are these notions that, well, there is the baby boomer generation, and there are all these other generations, whether it's X or Y or G or whatever it happens to be, and they view the world differently. I think there are times when we can be convinced that those differences are really, really crucial. And there have been times, I can think of like the 1990s, when there were scholars who thought that there was going to be a really messy conflict between generations in the Western world over government funding of Social Security versus doing something for younger people. And there were sociologists who talk about a sort of coming war, and it didn't happen. Now, it's not to say it won't happen now, but it is more common, I think, in the more contemporary period, to play with these ideas. A generation of 1968, or a generation going back, there were really path-breaking sociological studies of the generation of, the Great Depression. So this, it's obviously still important. I think what's a little unusual is treating things the way Nathan has done across the period he's doing, and being as explicit about generation. I think it's part of the sort of discourse right now. It's just very, very common. And sometimes it may be enlightening, and sometimes perhaps not.
Yeah, I mean, this is entirely anecdotal, but I gave a talk here in France to a large classroom full of about 100 French college students. And at some point, having never tried this before, I said, I was trying to sort of explain the generational hypothesis, and I said, how many of you think that you have the same worldview as your parents? Or no, I said the reverse. How many of you think you have a different worldview than your parents? And literally every hand in the room, save one, went up. Every single one. So, in the sample of 100 that I had there, it was 99 to 1 And then there was the one poor guy who was like, I think we have the same worldview. He seemed a little despairing to be the only one. But I think there's definitely a sense that there's a real difference. I just want to amplify what David said, though. I think there was this social scientific literature that insisted on a notion of conflict. And again, I think a lot of that comes out of this Karl Mannheim's original kind of argument about generation. And I'm just not sure that's the most helpful thing to retain from generations. And this is sort of why I'm just going to throw his name out there again, because I think he's not read enough by historians. Pierre Bourdieu actually is a scholar who thinks about generations. He doesn't really do it so explicitly. He doesn't really talk about generations, but his arguments are very much about the transmission of various forms of capital, right? Social capital and actual capital and other capital from generation to generation, and how that happens. The book, his famous book Distinction, is about the kind of transmission of cultural capital from generation to generation. So actually, his book or his thinking about generations is in many ways the opposite of Mannheim. His argument is, if anything, one of total stasis. It's just the continuation, the faithful transmission of cultural and other capital from generation to generation. And I don't know, in my own experience, that seems to be more accurate than this kind of hyper, sort of blown up notion of, radical discontinuity between generational worldviews. That seems to be a very particular artifact of a particular moment in the second half of the 20th century to me. But I'm way out over my skis and way out of my area of specialization. So I should probably.
There was a sociologist in France in the 1970s, Louis Roussel, who made the argument that in the early modern period, there was a kind of conflict of generations within households over material things, while there was continuity in the external society. And what has happened in the modern world, this gets back to your Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, there is solidarity within families and conflict out in the economy. It falls apart, of course, but it was an interesting hypothesis.
Yeah.
Aaliyah, we're out of time.
We are out of time. But it was such an excellent question. I didn't want to interrupt, so I wanted you both to respond to it. But yes, we are out of time. Just thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Nathan, for this really wonderful talk. I'm not a French historian. I'm really not, but I did enjoy this discussion so much, particularly the discussion on connections and how parallel the histories are within and between your books. And beyond that, I just loved the enthusiasm and the admiration that you both have for each other and for your work. That was very, very clear. And I think this is an amazing start to the new books celebration here at Brooklyn College. So thank you both so much. And thank you all for attending. Thanks to those who asked really wonderful questions.
Yes.
Yeah. And so have a good afternoon, everyone. Okay, bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Leah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye to colleagues and friends and students out there.
Bye, everyone.